Hey, it's Moody here, helping you to fish smarter, not harder. This week's blog post, we're going to take a look at jig heads and 3 tips to help you choose the right one. There's a lot of beginners out there getting into soft plastics these days. It's becoming very popular. So there's a few critical things to take into account, and we're going to run through them to help you choose the right jig head for your application. First up, let me say there are 2 kinds of jig heads. The first one being a belly weighted jig head on weedless hooks, which is predominantly a shallow water application. And then you also have the head weights, which is mostly used in deeper applications, and that's your standard jig heads with the weight on the very front. Now the first one we're going to have a look at is the belly weighted plastics. This is them here basically. What they are, they're a weedless hook, and weedless hooks sit up inside the top of the plastic. And of course it's used for shallow weed beds and all sorts of hard cover. And of course it's predominantly a shallow diving situation. Now because the weights are at the bottom along the shank of the hook, what it does, it acts like a keel, and that allows that lure to stay straight in the water. It's not going to fall over or go upside down. Once it's retrieved slowly, that will act as the keel. Now the weedless hook part of it, it's good in some respects because weedless means you can throw it up in amongst weed beds in the shallows and in tight cover and rarely hook up or get snagged on anything. But at the same time, when a fish grabs these lures, the hook's just hiding in the top of the lure there. When they grab it, quite often they don't depress it enough, or it just doesn't get in them right, and they just can't push that plastic down enough to get that hook to embed in them. So it doesn't have the hook up rate that a head weighted jig head does, but you certainly can't throw those around in tight cover because you're going to end up losing so many lures. So that's where the weedless jig head comes in. Now another thing with the weights, you'll notice that some are actually midway along the shank of the hook towards the rear, and others, like this one, are at the front. And what that does, that changes the falling angle of the lure. So if the weight's more forward, the lure will tend to want to drop more nose heavy. Rather than this one, it'd most likely sink rather flat when you let it drop. So it depends. If you want them to sink a bit faster, you'll have the weight towards the head. Now let's just have another look at these weights. Now as I mentioned, some weights are along the back end of the shank of the hook and others are well forward. Now for the beginners out there, you would use this one, and usually lightly weighted when you're still in shallow water, but the fish are either mid-water in shallow water and they're looking up to feed in the case of barra. So you would use this one and the lure would sink down nice and flat and slow. If you're still in a shallow water application, up to 2 meters of water or whatever, and the fish are actually on the bottom, if you can see them on the bottom on your side imager, you would use the one with the weight forward and probably a slightly heavier weight so that that is sinking a little bit more nose forward and it's coming down onto the fish's face, because that's what they like sometimes when they're on the bottom. They like it bouncing right on their face. So that's the difference between the two. One's going to sink flat and slow, and the other one's going to sink slightly forward and get to the bottom just a little bit quicker in the shallows. Now for the head weighted jig heads. This is a jig head that you predominantly use mostly in deeper water, and we'll show you why. First up, let's take a look at the jig head itself. Now see the towing point, how it's high on the hook, where other ones that are used for shallows are quite often on the front, like a bib lure. So these ones are on top for a reason, because the weight hanging underneath that is what keeps the lure straight, and it also, because you're in deep water, your pulling point is coming from the top more, like so. It's not coming from the front. Your pulling point's coming from up there because you are fishing in deeper water. So that allows you to make that lure dance and do whatever you want by raising and dropping the rod tip. And it's up to you how you just experiment with your retrieves. Some days I like it slow, other days I like it ripped a bit higher and falling on their nose. So the retrieves are up to you, or you can do one of my other premium courses to find out what the species like. So that's the beauty of the head weighted jigs, is your standard common jig heads that most people use. Now the other advantages of these is we use slightly bigger weights than you would in the belly weighted jig heads, so they get to the bottom a lot quicker and your lure falls head first, which makes it go to the bottom quicker as well. Another major benefit is that the hook is actually protruding out the top of the lure. Now this gives you a much better hookup rate than the weedless. But on the other hand, if you're throwing in tight cover, you're going to have all sorts of issues with snags. So that's the kind of thing that you've got to look out for. I find it's best in rubble areas, deep holes, areas where the fish aren't really aggregating in tight structure. So that's where you want to use those kind of jig heads. I'm going to show you now a few different scenarios that I have in front of me here. These big guys here, these are more for impoundment barra and big barra in the shallows, in tight cover around snags, that kind of thing. And it suits most paddle tail plastics and shads, those weedless hooks. This is the same kind of thing, except smaller, so make sure you choose the right jig heads to your lure size. You always want your jig head, you hold it in place there, that's where the nose is going to come out. This is a twist lock one, that twists into the front of the plastic, and then that lure will sit around about there. So you want that weight to be just under the hook and the top of the hook to be just inside the top of the plastic. That's why I would use that size for that lure there. Most plastics are designed, they have a gap already in them, top and bottom. Well, some don't have top, but some do. But this one here has one on the bottom, and that's an easy guide for when you're threading the hook through, so you know where the middle is. So all plastics have that, so keep an eye out for it when you're threading the hook in. Now these kind of lures here, you can use these anywhere around the world where you have predatory species in shallow water. This size here, if I was fishing in Australia, I'd be using for big barramundi. That size there, well, big barramundi will still eat them, but smaller barramundi, inshore fish like mangrove jacks, blue salmon, threadfin salmon, flathead will even take a lure this size, a good size flathead if you're down south. They might be a little bit big for bream at that size. So you could use the next size down again for species such as bream. Now the headweight jig heads, which is used in the deep water, these suit areas or species that like to aggregate in deep water in numbers. And that's what we primarily use these for. Aggregated fish down deeper. And of course, the size of the jig head that you would use would depend on the run, and you would need to experiment a bit with that first. You don't want your lure getting carried away with the run. Usually we flick them just up current of the school and let it sink down on the fish's nose right at the front of the school, and then just jig it slowly through the school. But if your lure's going down and then gone, you obviously need to go up to the next jig head weight, or you need to wait till the tide slows down. Common species we use these for in Australia are barramundi, threadfin salmon, blue salmon up here in North Queensland, finger mark, mangrove jack. You use the smaller models with the lighter weight jig heads. You can use them for maybe deep mangrove roots in sort of 3 meters of water. That's perfect for mangrove jacks. And even offshore, you can go up to the larger ones with larger jig heads and larger weights. You can use these offshore for species like gold spot cod, coral trout, nannygai, red emperor, those kind of things. This is one of my favourite plastics for barramundi. This is the high-tech swing impact fat. Yeah, it's got a bit of a funny name because when you put it on, it does look like a Jolly Roger. But it's a fantastic barra lure, and I've caught many large barramundis on these. They've come in a few different sizes, 4.8, 5.8 and 6.8s. I think there's a bigger model coming out next year. So keep an eye out for those puppies. They're a great little barramundi lure. So what we're going to do, I'll just show you two. We're going to put this hook in. There's 2 jig heads here. This is a bigger one. I would probably use this one on the next size up plastic, because when you lay it against there where you're going to put it through, that hook is just a little bit too far back for my liking. I want that weight to be just a little bit further forward. So I'm going to use that jig head there. So the hook's positioned just slightly a bit further forward, not right to the back. I like them just a little bit further forward. Helps them sink a bit better, and it gets that action rolling down on the fish's nose a lot better. Okay, with these jig heads, simply look for the centre of the hole there. Also, make sure you've got it upright and you've got the groove upright there, ready to go. So what I do is stick your eyelet in that groove so you know where your hook is going to be in centre and parallel. So right in the middle, thread that on so that it is running into the middle of the lure, up the middle, not down too deep or up too high. You want that barb, imagine that barb's coming around here and coming on this angle down here halfway. So that's what I'm going to do, and I'm going to push it around with my finger, around the shank at the same time. Now it's going to come out right in the middle of that gap, that groove, push him along, push the jig head right up, and that's kind of in the right spot, just a little tiny bit out. If you are a bit out, like I say, you can measure it like this, hold it there, find out exactly where the hook's got to come out, and then you hold it. I kind of stuffed that one up just a little tiny bit. So I'll come back out and I'll go back in again. It's a little bit further. Much better. So that's how you rig the head weight plastics. Play around with it a little bit, it's going to take you a little while, and even sometimes the best of us stuff up. So yeah, it's just playing around with it, mark where it's got to sit in there first. The hard bit is going to be getting that hook to stay roughly in the center of the lure until you're ready to bring it out to the top. So play around with it, go and buy some plastics, go and buy some jig heads, muck around and take them down the pool, check out their actions. That's the best way. You can see exactly what the fish are seeing then. Try your slow actions, try your falling actions, try your belly weighted jig heads and try your head weighted jig heads. Hopefully we've clarified a few of the issues regarding jig heads for you beginners out there. So if you did like this little tip and you would like to see more, subscribe to our YouTube channel, like us on Facebook, and if you only want some special information I send out by email only, head on over to our website www.ryanmoodyfishing.com and sign up for free email updates. Get into the great outdoors, keep fishing smarter, and we'll see you next time.